I'm sorry. Ma'am, your name isn't on the list. The young staff member said it politely, but her finger stayed frozen halfway down the printed page, like she was hoping the letters might rearrange themselves if she stared long enough. I leaned slightly closer to the table, trying to see the list myself, but all I saw were unfamiliar names printed in clean military font, neat, official, and permanent. There must be a mistake, I said calmly, though my chest had already started tightening. Could you check again? Rachel Monroe. She nodded and flipped to another sheet. I watched her lips move silently as she scanned each line. Around me, people walked past in polished uniforms and pressed suits, laughter drifting through the warm San Diego air. Flags lined the walkway, snapping gently in the breeze. And somewhere deeper inside the hall, a rehearsal band struck a sharp brass note that echoed across the courtyard. Still nothing. Her finger reached the bottom of the second list. I'm sorry, she repeated, softer this time. Your name isn't here. Before I could respond, a familiar voice cut through the moment. Let me see that. Commander Daniel Reeves stepped beside me, crisp in his dress whites, confidence rolling off him like heat from pavement. He barely glanced at me before taking the clipboard from the staff member's hand. His eyes skimmed the list for less than 3 seconds. Then he scoffed. She doesn't belong here. He said it loudly enough that the couple standing behind me stopped mid-step. I felt the shift instantly, the quiet ripple of attention, the subtle tilt of heads, the weight of strangers deciding who I was based on a single sentence. I didn't argue. I didn't react. I just stood there, feeling the familiar tightening in my chest, the same one I'd carried for years. At that exact moment, my parents walked past. They didn't stop, didn't hesitate, didn't even look at me. My mother reached up to straighten Daniel's collar, smoothing the fabric with practiced hands. My father laughed at something one of Daniel's colleagues said, shaking hands firmly, his voice full of pride. They walked straight past me like I wasn't standing there at all, like I didn't exist. I stayed where I was, staring at the entrance as the crowd continued flowing around me. Daniel handed the clipboard back to the staff member without another word, already turning toward the waiting guests. He didn't glance over his shoulder. Not once. That was what stung the most. Not the missing name. Not the whispering. The certainty. He hadn't sounded surprised. He'd sounded sure. I stepped aside from the check-in table, moving just far enough to avoid blocking the entrance. People filed past me smoothly, their conversations blending into a steady hum of celebration. Someone laughed loudly nearby. Someone else adjusted a medal pinned to their chest. Everyone had somewhere to go. Everyone had a place. Except me. A security guard stood a few feet away, arms folded across his chest. I noticed him glance at me once, then again, longer the second time. Not curious, not annoyed. Recognizing, that unsettled me more than anything Daniel had said. I shifted my weight and folded my arms loosely, trying to appear composed. I'd learned years ago how to hold still under pressure, how to keep my expression neutral even when something inside me twisted tight. Daniel had always been the center of our family's gravity. Growing up, every award he won had been framed and displayed in the living room. Every promotion celebrated with dinner reservations and phone calls to relatives. His achievements weren't just his, they belonged to all of us. Mine had never carried that same weight. When I enlisted and chose logistics support, my father had called it solid work. Reliable, necessary, useful, not impressive. Support work, he'd said once at dinner. Work that happened behind the scenes. Not the kind people applauded. A memory flickered at the edge of my mind, Daniel standing at the dining table years ago, holding up a trophy while my mother clapped proudly. I'd been sitting beside him, my own certificate still folded inside my backpack because no one had asked how my day went. That same quiet dismissal lived here now, hanging in the air between us like it always had. Inside the hall, I caught a glimpse of a large banner hanging above the stage, recognizing Commander Daniel Reeves. His name stretched across polished white fabric in bold navy letters. Bright. Impossible to miss. My name, meanwhile, existed nowhere. Not on the list. Not on the program. Not even in passing conversation. I felt the edge of something old pressing against my thoughts. Something from 3 years ago. A memory that refused to settle. The night everything changed. After that incident, the phone calls from home had stopped almost overnight. Invitations dried up. Conversations shortened. Eventually, silence replaced everything else. Not anger. Not confrontation. Just distance. Like I'd stepped outside an invisible boundary no one had explained to me. A pair of guests passed close enough that I caught fragments of their conversation. Is that her? I thought she wasn't invited. I kept my face still, pretending not to hear. But the words landed anyway. Sharp and deliberate. Rumors had survived longer than truth. They always did. Across the courtyard, Daniel laughed again, shaking hands with a senior officer. The sound carried easily through the open space. He looked confident. Relaxed, exactly the way he always did when the spotlight found him. Still, he didn't look toward me. Not once. I exhaled slowly and stepped farther from the entrance, moving toward the outer edge of the parking boundary. The sun felt warmer out here. Less crowded. Less suffocating. For a moment, I considered leaving. Just turning around, walking back to my car and disappearing before anyone could stop me. That had always been my instinct, withdraw quietly. Avoid conflict. Maintain dignity by removing myself from situations where I clearly wasn't wanted. But another thought pressed against that instinct. Why should I leave? Why should I walk away from something I had every right to attend? That question stayed with me as I watched the steady line of vehicles pulling into the lot. Families arriving late. Officers stepping out of polished sedans. Everything moving in practiced order. Then I noticed something different. A staff member walked past me carrying a tablet. He slowed slightly as he passed, glancing at my face. His eyes lingered for a second too long before he continued moving. Recognition again. Not curiosity. Recognition. That was the second time now. I felt a slow unease building beneath the surface of my thoughts. Inside the hall, the music shifted into a new arrangement, brighter, louder. Applause echoed faintly through the open doors. Someone announced instructions over a microphone, their voice crisp and formal. But beneath all of that, another sound began to form. Low, rhythmic, deep enough to vibrate faintly through the pavement beneath my feet. At first, I thought it was distant construction or heavy equipment moving somewhere off base. Then the sound grew louder. Closer. Engines. Not one vehicle. Several. I turned slightly toward the road beyond the entrance. A line of dark vehicles appeared in the distance, moving slowly but deliberately toward the gate. Security officers near the entrance straightened instinctively, their posture tightening in unison. Conversations around me faltered. Even the casual laughter faded into uncertain silence. Something was changing. I didn't know what yet, but I could feel it moving toward us. And as the convoy rolled closer, I felt a strange tightening in my chest, not fear. Not exactly. Recognition. Like the past I'd been avoiding for years had finally caught up to me. Daniel stood near the center of the hall entrance, surrounded by officers whose laughter carried easily through the open doors. I stayed where I was outside the boundary line, watching the celebration unfold from a distance that felt wider than the few yards between us. My mother reached up again to adjust Daniel's collar, smoothing the fabric as if perfection could be pressed into existence with her fingertips. That simple gesture hit harder than his words earlier. She used to do that for me before school presentations when I was younger. Straighten my shirt. Brush invisible lint from my shoulders. Tell me to stand tall. I couldn't remember the last time she'd touched me like that. Daniel smiled confidently as another officer clapped him on the back. My father stood nearby, shaking hands with guests, his posture proud and relaxed. The same posture he'd carried every time Daniel achieved something worth celebrating. I watched Daniel carefully. For just a second, his gaze drifted toward the entrance. Toward me, but instead of holding eye contact, he turned his back deliberately, leaning into conversation with another officer like I wasn't there at all. That small decision landed heavier than anything he'd said earlier. It wasn't anger. It was dismissal. The kind that told everyone else exactly how to treat me. The memory surfaced before I could stop it. 3 years earlier, late evening inside the Logistics Operations Center. Fluorescent lights buzzed softly overhead, casting everything in sterile white. The room smelled faintly of paper, electronics, and burnt coffee, the familiar scent of long shifts and careful routines. I sat at my terminal reviewing shipment manifests, scrolling line by line through cargo codes and routing schedules. Everything looked routine at first. Nothing unusual, just another verification cycle before deployment. Then the alert appeared, a small red notification blinking in the corner of the screen. Routing conflict detected. I leaned closer to the monitor, rereading the shipment number. My pulse slowed slightly as recognition settled in. That shipment was tied to Daniel's upcoming unit movement. At the time, it hadn't felt personal, just procedural. But I remembered the quiet tension that crept into my chest as I checked the routing logs again. The system flagged a discrepancy, nothing catastrophic, but enough to require manual confirmation before release. Standard protocol. No exceptions. I requested verification. Paused clearance. Waited. Within minutes, the room shifted from quiet routine to controlled urgency. Phones rang. Radios crackled. Conversations rose in volume, sharp and fast. Officers moved in and out of the room with clipped movements, their voices tight with pressure. And then Daniel appeared. He wasn't scheduled to be there that night. That was the first thing that felt wrong. He stepped into the operations center with a kind of urgency I hadn't seen from him before. His uniform still crisp. His expression tight but controlled. "Why did you delay it?" he asked. Not what's wrong. Not is there a problem? Just accusation. I explained the routing discrepancy calmly, pointing at the screen, showing him the flagged entry. Protocol required verification. No shipment moved without clearance. He listened, but not patiently. "Approve it," he said quietly. "We don't have time for this delay." His tone carried pressure, not concern. That memory stayed with me long after the moment passed. I shook my head slightly in the present, forcing the memory back into place. The noise of the ceremony drifted toward me again. Applause. Footsteps. Voices blending into something hollow. Back then, I had followed protocol. Every step. Every procedure. Still, the consequences arrived quickly. Within hours of the delay, deployment timelines shifted. Other units had to adjust schedules. Reports labeled the situation as an operational disruption, the kind of bureaucratic phrasing that softened blame without removing it. And somehow, that blame settled squarely on me. I remembered the night I returned home after the inquiry began. The house had been quiet when I walked through the door. My father sat at the kitchen table, hands folded tightly in front of him. My mother stood at the sink, her back turned. Daniel leaned against the doorway, waiting, not welcoming, not comforting, watching. No one asked what had happened, not once. No one asked why I delayed the shipment or what the system flagged. They didn't ask about safety or protocol or risk. Daniel spoke first. "You embarrassed the family?" That was all he said. Not "you made a mistake." Not what happened. Just embarrassment. Shame placed neatly on my shoulders without discussion. Back in the present, I exhaled slowly, watching as more guests passed me without acknowledgement. The memory of those days settled heavily in my chest. After the incident, the silence from my family spread quickly. Phone calls stopped. Messages went unanswered. Invitations disappeared without explanation. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Quietly. Systematically. Like someone slowly closing doors one at a time. The military inquiry had followed soon after. I remembered sitting inside a small office across from a legal consultant assigned to review my statement. He spoke carefully, his voice low and measured. "Say only what is documented," he advised. That line had confused me at the time. I'd expected encouragement to tell everything, to explain the full sequence of events. Instead, he focused on documentation, on precision, on limitation. I remembered asking him one question before leaving that office. Was anyone else investigated? He paused. Not long, but long enough. Then he answered carefully. We are reviewing all available data. It sounded official, neutral. But the hesitation lingered in my memory long after the meeting ended. I shifted slightly where I stood now, my fingers brushing against the edge of my bag. The sound of Daniel's name being announced inside drifted faintly through the open doors, followed by another round of applause. I glanced toward the entrance again, watching the movement of people inside. Their conversations flowed easily, their confidence untouched by doubt. For years, I had assumed the investigation would reveal the truth on its own, that facts would speak louder than assumptions, that patience would lead to resolution. But patience had only led to silence, and silence had allowed rumors to grow. A flicker of movement caught my attention. 2 guests passed near me, speaking quietly but not quietly enough. That's the one. One whispered. The delay officer. The other replied. I kept my face still, though the words settled heavily against old wounds. Rumors had shaped my reputation without my voice ever entering the conversation. That realization landed differently now. Not just painful, suspicious. A memory surfaced suddenly, one detail I had ignored for years. System logs. Timestamps. There had been one entry recorded after I logged off the terminal that night. I remembered noticing it briefly during the review, but dismissing the confusion under pressure. At the time, exhaustion had clouded my focus. Now, standing outside this ceremony, that detail felt sharper, clearer, impossible to ignore. I reached into my bag instinctively, brushing my fingers against the old access badge I still carried. I never knew why I kept it. Maybe because letting it go felt like admitting defeat. Inside the hall, another wave of applause echoed loudly. Daniel's name again. Celebration continuing. But beneath the noise, something else stirred inside me. Not shame, not humiliation, doubt. What if the delay wasn't the real problem? What if someone needed it to look like my fault? I stared at the entrance, the sound of distant engines still humming faintly in the background. And for the first time in 3 years, a new question settled heavily in my mind. If someone changed those records that night, who needed me to take the blame? And why? I stayed near the outer edge of the entrance, far enough that people stopped brushing past my shoulder, but close enough to still hear the ceremony unfolding inside. Applause rose again from the hall, sharp and proud, followed by the steady rhythm of formal announcements. Every sound felt like it belonged to a world I was no longer part of. I kept my eyes on the doorway, watching families move in and out, their faces bright with celebration. Everyone looked like they belonged somewhere. Everyone except me. The same security technician from earlier passed by again, slower this time. I noticed him from the corner of my eye before he reached me. His steps weren't hurried, but they weren't casual either. There was intention in the way he moved, like he had made a decision and was still weighing whether to follow through. He stopped about 2 feet away, close enough that I could hear his breathing. You're Rachel Monroe, aren't you? His voice was quiet, careful, like he didn't want the question to carry beyond the space between us. I turned my head slightly toward him, studying his face. Late 40s, maybe. Civilian badge clipped to his belt. Lines around his eyes that suggested years of long shifts and quiet observation. Have we met? I asked. He hesitated, not dramatically, just long enough to make the pause noticeable. I worked nights in logistics, he said finally. The same night your system went down. My stomach tightened. That single sentence reached backward 3 years and dragged the past straight into the present. He glanced over his shoulder, scanning the crowd behind him. Guests moved past us without paying attention, their laughter blending into the distant music from inside the hall. No one noticed us standing there. Not yet. From inside his jacket, he pulled out a sealed manila envelope. The edges were slightly worn, corners softened from handling. It wasn't new. It had been stored somewhere for a long time, kept safe. Hidden. Protected. He held it between two fingers but didn't hand it over immediately. Instead, he looked at me again. "You never saw the full report, did you?" I felt the question land somewhere deep in my chest. "No," I answered quietly. He nodded once, like he had expected that answer all along. Then he placed the envelope into my hands. "This was never meant to reach you." The words didn't sound dramatic. They sounded factual. That made them heavier. I stared down at the envelope, feeling the stiffness of paper stacked inside. More than a few pages. Not a short memo or simple notice. A full report. Official. Important. My fingers pressed lightly against the surface, feeling the thickness of whatever truth rested inside. The seal had already been broken once before and pressed shut again. Uneven and careless. Someone had opened this. Someone had read it. Then hidden it. For a moment, I hesitated. Not because I was afraid to read. Because I knew that once I did, there would be no going back to uncertainty. I slid my finger beneath the flap and pulled it open. The first sheet inside carried official formatting, clean margins, structured paragraphs, military documentation language. The header caught my eye immediately. Incident Review Summary. The date beneath it matched exactly with the night everything changed. My name appeared halfway down the first page. Rachel Monroe. Printed in bold. Seeing it written there made my pulse slow instead of quicken. I forced myself to read carefully, line by line, resisting the urge to skim. Primary delay authorized by Officer Monroe. That matched what I already knew. What everyone already believed? No surprise yet? But then my eyes moved lower, to a section I didn't recognize. Supplemental System Audit. I blinked slowly. I didn't remember that section ever being discussed during the investigation. Not during meetings. Not during the legal review. Not in any conversation afterward. It had never been shown to me. That alone made my chest tighten. I read further. Audit logs showed system access occurring after my scheduled log-off time. 47 minutes later. I stopped breathing for a moment. 47 minutes. That wasn't possible. I remembered leaving the terminal clearly, shutting down my station, collecting my files, walking out of the operations center with fatigue pressing behind my eyes. Yet the log displayed my authorization credentials being used. My ID. My code. My authority. But I hadn't been there. Beneath the entry sat a verification signature. Not mine. Stamped neatly below the altered record. I scanned quickly for the name attached to the verification line. My eyes locked onto it. Thomas Granger. The name felt familiar in a way that made my pulse tighten again. Not military. Civilian. Something about it tugged at memory. Then it hit me. Years ago, long before the incident, I'd seen that name in our house. At a dinner table. My father shaking hands with a civilian guest who spoke confidently about system security and logistics efficiency. Thomas Granger. The same man. The connection sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with temperature. I lifted my head slowly and looked back at the technician. "Why are you giving me this now?" I asked. He exhaled quietly before answering. "Because someone ordered that section removed from your case file." The words settled into place like pieces of machinery locking together. Removed. Not overlooked. Not misplaced. Removed. Deliberately. He lowered his voice further. They didn't just protect someone. He paused, eyes scanning the crowd again before finishing. They protected a story. That sentence changed everything. Not protecting a person. Protecting reputation. Protecting appearances. Protecting narrative. I shouldn't even be standing here, he added quietly. The warning was clear. Risk existed. Real risk. Not hypothetical. I flipped through the remaining pages quickly now, searching for patterns. Internal correspondence logs filled the middle section. Names. Approvals. Message timestamps. One name repeated again and again. Granger. And then another appeared further down the page. Not bold. Not highlighted. Just copied quietly into the approval chain. Harold Reeves. My father. The air around me suddenly felt thinner. I didn't fully understand what it meant yet, not completely, but the proximity alone made my stomach turn. Family. System access. Authorization chains. Connections that had never seemed important before now lined up in ways that made my chest tighten. I closed the folder halfway, staring down at the pages without reading further. Fear settled into me then. Not fear of exposure, fear of realization. Because if someone altered those records, then someone chose me to carry the blame, and that choice might not have come from strangers. I glanced up, but the technician was already stepping away, blending into the moving crowd like he had never been there at all. His final words lingered in my mind. They needed someone reliable to blame. The envelope felt heavier in my hands now. Not because of the paper, because of what it meant. I stared down at the open pages again, scanning the signatures one more time, searching for meaning I wasn't ready to accept. If someone needed me to take the fall, who needed protection badly enough to destroy my name? I stood near the boundary fence, the envelope still open in my hands. The distant sounds of applause drifting from inside the hall like echoes from another life. My fingers tightened slightly around the stack of papers as I forced myself to read the audit page again. Slower this time. Not like a victim. Like an officer. Like someone trained to notice patterns others ignored. My eyes moved carefully across the authorization entry. My name was printed clearly. My code sat beside it. Unmistakable. My signature rested at the bottom of the form. But something about it felt wrong. Not obvious at first. Not dramatic. Just off. I leaned closer, narrowing my focus on the final stroke of the signature. I had signed my name thousands of times during my service. Fast. Efficient. Automatic. My hand always ended with a slight upward flick at the end of the final letter. It was muscle memory. Something I never had to think about. That flick wasn't there. Instead, the signature ended flat. Careful, controlled. Too careful. Someone had tried to copy it. And suddenly, I understood something that made my chest tighten. They hadn't just copied my signature once. They had practiced it. The memory came back without warning. Weeks before the shipment incident, we had been sitting at the family dining table, the smell of roasted chicken filling the room, glasses clinking softly against ceramic plates. Daniel had arrived that evening still wearing his uniform, confidence radiating off him like always. He dropped a folder beside my plate casually. "Hey, can you sign this?" he asked, sliding the papers toward me. Just routine logistics acknowledgement. I didn't question it. Why would I? He was my brother. Family meant trust. I picked up the pen and signed quickly without reading the entire document. He watched closely as I did it, his expression neutral, almost distracted. "It's standard paperwork," he said when I hesitated briefly. Nothing complicated. At the time, it had felt harmless, routine, forgettable. Standing outside the ceremony now, I flipped deeper into the report with unsteady fingers. There it was, a scanned clearance form dated weeks before the incident. My signature sat at the bottom, except it wasn't quite mine. The curve of the letters looked stiff, forced, like someone trying too hard to match a rhythm they didn't fully understand. That earlier signature had been used as practice. Preparation. Not accident. Not improvisation. Planning. I felt my breathing slow as realization spread through my chest. This hadn't started the night of the shipment delay. It had started long before that. I turned another page. Promotion review timelines appeared in neat columns of dates and annotations. My eyes scanned quickly, searching for patterns. Daniel's name appeared repeatedly, highlighted alongside commendations and performance summaries. Then I saw it. A notation referencing the same deployment period connected to my delay. The incident had been reframed in official language. Operational resilience success. Not disruption. Not complication. Success. My stomach tightened as I read further. Because of the delay, because of my hesitation, the unit had been forced to adjust strategy quickly. That adjustment had later been described as evidence of adaptability under pressure. Daniel's leadership had been praised, commended, rewarded, while I had absorbed the blame. The realization settled heavily in my chest. My delay had created a situation that made him look decisive, strong, reliable. I turned to the internal communication logs next, my fingers moving faster now. Names appeared beside approval stamps, some familiar, others unfamiliar. One name repeated over and over. Thomas Granger. Then another appeared near the bottom of a notification chain. Not bold, not highlighted, just copied quietly. Harold Reeves. My father. I froze. Not because I didn't recognize the name, because I recognized it too well. I remembered a dinner years ago when Thomas Granger had sat at our table, laughing easily with my father over coffee. They spoke about systems, audits, efficiency. My father had listened closely, nodding with interest, asking detailed questions. At the time, I'd assumed it was casual networking. Now it felt like something else entirely. Too familiar, too comfortable. I stepped away from the entrance, moving closer to the outer fence where the noise of the crowd softened slightly. I needed space to think, to breathe, to understand what I was seeing. Because this wasn't just institutional error anymore. This felt personal, dangerously personal. Another memory surfaced unexpectedly. The night after the investigation began, my father had shown up at my apartment unannounced. He carried a small bag of takeout containers, setting them gently on my kitchen counter like it was any ordinary evening. "I thought you might not feel like cooking," he said quietly. At the time, I had interpreted his visit as support, concern. Now, remembering his expression, something felt different. His voice had been too calm, too controlled, as if he already knew more than he admitted. I remembered him sitting across from me at the table, hands folded neatly together. "Sometimes accepting blame protects more than fighting it," he said. Back then, I thought he meant protecting family reputation, avoiding unnecessary attention, keeping conflict contained. Now, standing here with this file in my hands, the meaning shifted. What if he wasn't protecting me? What if he was protecting himself? The thought sent a cold wave through my chest. Inside the ceremony hall, applause erupted again, louder this time. Daniel's name echoed faintly through the speakers, followed by cheers that carried across the courtyard. I glanced toward the open doors. The celebration continued as if nothing had changed, as if everything still made sense. But it didn't. Not anymore. I turned back to the final pages inside the envelope. The paper felt heavier now, each line carrying more weight than the last. One document caught my attention immediately. Restricted clearance review, stamped clearly across the top. Internal use only. My fingers hesitated briefly before turning the page. The report outlined final authorization details, technical approvals, credential validations, supervisory signatures. Then I saw it. Authorization duplication approved under supervisory request. Not automated. Not system error. Approved. Someone with authority had allowed this. My pulse slowed as I scanned the approving authority section. The name had been partially redacted, black ink covering most of the letters. But not all. Enough remained visible. Enough letters to recognize the pattern. Enough to understand. The initials matched a consulting identification code I had seen my father use years earlier, on documents, on email headers, on official correspondence. Not fully confirmed, but unmistakably close. Too close to ignore. I lowered the file slowly, my fingers tightening around the edges as memories replayed themselves in rapid sequence. Family dinners, quiet conversations, unexplained silences. Everything looked different now. Not distance, not disappointment. Strategy. Careful. Deliberate strategy. I closed the envelope halfway and looked toward the ceremony hall again. My family stood proudly near the front, unaware that the truth was already beginning to surface outside their carefully built image. For the first time, my father shifted slightly in his seat, glancing toward the entrance as if sensing something approaching. I held the envelope tightly against my chest, feeling the weight of years pressing inward. If my father helped authorize the forged records, did he do it to protect Daniel? Or to protect himself? The sound reached us before the vehicles came into view. Low. Steady. Heavy enough that I could feel the faint vibration through the pavement beneath my shoes. It cut through the music drifting from inside the ceremony hall, replacing polished celebration with something colder, more deliberate. I lifted my head slowly, eyes moving toward the road beyond the gate. Security officers near the entrance shifted at the same time, their posture tightening in practiced unison. Conversations faltered around me. Laughter faded into uncertain silence. The atmosphere changed without a single word spoken. That was when the first vehicle appeared. Black. Unmarked. Moving slowly through the gate with controlled precision, another followed behind it. Then another. Not rushed. Not chaotic. Measured. The kind of movement that didn't ask permission. It demanded attention. I watched as the convoy rolled forward, stopping in a neat line near the ceremony entrance. Doors opened almost simultaneously. Uniformed personnel stepping out in sequence. Their movements were calm, efficient, practiced. One figure stood out immediately. Rear Admiral Marcus Bennett. I recognized him before my mind fully processed why. Late 50s. Composed posture, shoulders squared with quiet authority. I had seen his name years ago during internal briefings, printed in documents that never reached public discussion. He had been part of the investigation chain, distant, unreachable, untouchable. Seeing him here now felt impossible. Like the past had stepped out of paper and into reality. Inside the hall, the music stopped abruptly. The sudden silence echoed through the open doors, followed by a faint squeal of microphone feedback. Guests inside shifted in confusion, voices lowering into cautious murmurs. Daniel stood near the front of the stage, his body angled toward the podium. From where I stood, I could see the confusion flicker across his face. He wasn't afraid yet, just surprised. Admiral Bennett walked through the entrance without hesitation, flanked by two officers who stayed slightly behind him. He didn't pause to greet anyone, didn't smile, didn't acknowledge the crowd. Authority didn't need introduction. It created its own silence. Through the open doorway, I watched as my father's posture changed almost instantly. His hand gripped the back of a chair, fingers tightening against the polished wood. My mother shifted slightly beside him, her expression uncertain, lips pressed together. Daniel remained standing at attention, but his shoulders looked tighter now, less relaxed, less confident. I noticed something else. My father wasn't looking at Daniel. He was staring directly at the podium, waiting. Inside the hall, Admiral Bennett stepped forward and adjusted the microphone. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every guest in the room turned toward him instinctively. "This ceremony will pause temporarily," he said. His voice carried clearly through the speakers, calm but unmistakably firm. No explanation followed, just silence. The crowd reacted immediately, low murmurs spreading like ripples through water. Conversations broke into whispers. Heads leaned toward one another, searching for answers no one seemed to have. Outside, I felt the tension settle into my chest like weight. This wasn't random. This wasn't routine. This was directed. Inside the hall, Admiral Bennett leaned slightly toward one of the officers beside him. He handed over a small folded document, something too small to read from where I stood. The officer nodded once, then turned, scanning the crowd. Not casually, searching. Another officer joined him, eyes moving carefully across rows of seated guests. Their focus was deliberate, calculated, not general inspection, targeted observation. I noticed one officer glance toward the entrance, toward me. Recognition flashed briefly across his face before he continued scanning the room. A slow unease settled deeper into my chest. This wasn't coincidence. Not anymore. Inside the hall, Daniel shifted his stance slightly, turning his head toward my father. I watched carefully, reading the silent exchange between them. Daniel's jaw tightened. His breathing grew shallow. Subtle, but visible. He leaned slightly toward my father, whispering something I couldn't hear. My father responded with the smallest nod, barely noticeable unless you were watching closely. Reassurance. Or instruction. I couldn't tell which. The room inside grew quieter with each passing second. Even the whispers began to fade, replaced by heavy anticipation. Guests leaned forward slightly in their seats, waiting for explanation. Outside, the envelope pressed against my palm felt heavier than ever. Proof in one hand, authority in the room. Two forces moving toward collision. I shifted my weight slightly, steadying my breathing as the tension around me built. My thoughts moved quickly, connecting details I didn't fully understand yet. Had someone reopened the case? Had something triggered this moment? Inside the hall, Admiral Bennett returned to the microphone. His gaze swept slowly across the audience. Careful, methodical, not searching blindly. Selecting, measuring. His eyes moved across rows of guests, pausing briefly on several faces before continuing. The silence stretched longer than felt comfortable. Even the air inside the room seemed to hold still. I felt my heartbeat slow instead of racing. Heavy. Controlled? Anticipation pressing into every breath. Admiral Bennett raised the microphone again. Before this ceremony continues, he began. His voice remained steady. Calm. Impossible to ignore. There is one individual we need present. The room stilled completely. No whispers. No movement. Just waiting. I felt the moment before it arrived, like pressure building before a storm breaks. Every muscle in my body tightened slightly. Instincts sharpening in ways I hadn't felt in years. Then he spoke my name. Rachel Monroe, please step forward. For a second, I didn't move. Every head inside the hall turned toward the entrance at once. The shift felt physical, like the room itself had rotated to face me. I saw my mother turn first. Her eyes widened slightly. Then Daniel, confusion flashing across his face before recognition settled in. And finally my father. For the first time that day, he looked directly at me. Not past me. Not around me. At me. And what I saw in his expression wasn't disappointment. Wasn't anger. Wasn't pride. It was fear. Every eye in the room stayed fixed on me as I stepped across the threshold. The silence felt heavier inside than it had outside. Thick enough that even my footsteps sounded too loud against the polished floor. I moved slowly down the center aisle, feeling hundreds of stares pressing against my back, my shoulders, my face. I didn't rush, didn't hesitate. Just walked. Each step felt deliberate, like I was retracing a path I had once taken in reverse, walking away years ago under suspicion, leaving with my head lowered and my future uncertain. Now I was moving forward again, not because I wanted attention, but because it had found me. I passed row after row of guests. Some leaned slightly away as I approached, whispering under their breath. Others stared openly, curiosity replacing confusion. A few officers sat straighter in their seats, recognition beginning to replace rumor. I kept my gaze forward, until I reached the front. Rear Admiral Bennett stood waiting beside the podium, his expression calm but watchful. When I stopped a few feet away, he studied my face carefully, like he was confirming something he had already believed. Officer Monroe, he said quietly. The title landed differently than my name had. Not Rachel. Officer. Recognition returned through a single word. He held up a printed document in his hand. Do you recognize this? I glanced at the paper, and my pulse slowed the moment I saw it. The same audit file. The same formatting. The same signatures I had read minutes earlier outside. But this one was official, clean, properly sealed, prepared for presentation. Yes, sir, I answered. My voice sounded steady, stronger than I expected. Admiral Bennett nodded once, then turned toward the assembled audience. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his movements slow and deliberate. 3 years ago, he began, his voice carrying across the room with calm authority. An operational delay occurred during a scheduled shipment transfer. A ripple moved through the audience. I heard whispers form immediately, some confused, others already aware of fragments of the story. Daniel stood just off to my right, his body rigid. From the corner of my eye, I saw him glance toward me briefly before shifting his focus back to the Admiral. Admiral Bennett continued. At the time, the delay was recorded as a disruption. He paused. Not long. Just long enough for the room to settle again. Then he spoke the words that changed everything. The delay was not a failure. Silence fell instantly. Not polite silence. Real silence. Heavy. Confused. The delay, he continued, was a preventive action. A quiet wave of disbelief moved through the crowd. Guests leaned toward one another, whispering quickly. I heard fragments of confusion drifting through the air. Preventive. Not failure. Not mistake. Admiral Bennett allowed the murmurs to fade before continuing. The decision made by Officer Monroe prevented unauthorized shipment movement. My chest tightened as the words settled over the room. Prevented? Not delayed. Not disrupted. Prevented. The difference mattered more than anyone outside this room could understand. For years, I had carried the weight of that night, the accusations, the silence, the quiet judgment that followed me wherever I went. Hearing those words spoken publicly felt surreal, like stepping into a version of reality that had been denied to me. Beside me, Daniel shifted again. I turned my head slightly, catching a glimpse of his expression. Confusion had replaced certainty. His brows tightened, eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to understand something that didn't fit his expectations. Then Admiral Bennett spoke again, and the room changed completely. Evidence now confirms, he said evenly, that system logs were intentionally altered. The words struck like a physical impact. Altered? Not mistaken. Not misfiled. Altered. Whispers erupted again, louder this time. Conversations overlapped, spreading uncertainty across the room like a sudden storm. Chairs creaked as guests shifted in their seats. I looked toward my family. My mother gripped her purse tightly in her lap, her knuckles pale against the leather. Her lips parted slightly, but no sound came out. Daniel's breathing had changed, shorter, faster. His shoulders remained squared. But the confidence I had seen earlier had begun to fracture. And my father stared at the floor. Not at me, not at the Admiral. Down, avoiding everything. Admiral Bennett lifted another document, holding it up so the audience could see. This record shows authorization activity occurring after Officer Monroe had already logged off the system. His finger tapped the page once. Clear. Deliberate. Credentials were used without her authorization. The whispers grew louder again, spreading across rows of guests who leaned forward, eyes fixed on the front of the room. Unauthorized use. Identity misuse. Those words changed the narrative completely. I felt something shift inside me, not relief exactly, but movement. The heavy weight I'd carried for years began loosening slightly, as if truth itself was creating space where shame once lived. I glanced again toward Daniel. This time, he looked at my father. Not at the Admiral. Not at me. At him. His eyes searched for something, explanation, reassurance, denial. But my father remained motionless, his expression tight and unreadable. That silence told its own story. Admiral Bennett spoke again, his voice cutting cleanly through the growing noise. The evidence confirms deliberate interference. Not speculation. Not suspicion. Confirmation. The words settled over the room like final judgment. Deliberate. Intentional. Planned. I felt my breathing slow again, steady and controlled. Years of uncertainty pressed against this single moment, threatening to break apart under the weight of truth finally spoken aloud. For the first time since this began, I didn't feel invisible. I didn't feel dismissed. I felt seen. Not as a mistake, not as a problem, but as someone who had done exactly what she was trained to do. Admiral Bennett paused once more, allowing the murmurs to fade into uneasy silence. Then he spoke again. "We have identified who authorized the falsified entries." The room froze instantly. Every whisper died. Every movement stopped. Even the air seemed to hold still. My pulse slowed, heavy and steady inside my chest. "And that individual," he continued, "is present here today." A wave of tension swept through the room. Heads turned. Eyes scanned. Searching. Waiting. I felt my gaze move automatically toward my father. Not because I wanted to. Because something inside me already knew. The room held its breath. No one moved. No one spoke. Even the quiet shifting of fabric and chairs had stopped. As if the entire hall understood that the next words would change everything. I stood beside the podium, feeling the silence stretch so tightly it almost hurt. My pulse moved slowly, heavy and controlled, each beat echoing through my chest like distant thunder. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw my father shift his weight slightly. It was the first movement he'd made since the announcement. Small, barely noticeable, but enough. Admiral Bennett didn't rush. He adjusted the microphone slightly, his expression calm, his posture steady. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly to the farthest corners of the room. "The authorization for falsified system records was issued by civilian consultant Harold Reeves." My father's name landed in the center of the room like a dropped weight. Gasps rippled through the audience. Chairs creaked as people shifted in shock. Whispered voices broke out instantly, spreading from one row to the next. I didn't turn immediately. Hearing his name spoken publicly felt heavier than seeing it printed on paper. It felt permanent now, official. Undeniable. Impossible to erase. Slowly, I turned. My father stood frozen where he had been seated. His shoulders tight. His eyes lowered. The confidence that once defined him had vanished completely. His jaw clenched. But he didn't look at me. He couldn't. My mother sat beside him, her hands trembling against her lap. Her eyes widened, confusion and disbelief colliding across her face. She looked from the Admiral to my father, then back again, searching for some explanation that wasn't coming. Daniel reacted differently. He stared at our father as if he were seeing him for the first time. Not with anger. Not yet. With disbelief. Shock settled into his features slowly, replacing the certainty he had carried all morning. Admiral Bennett continued, his voice steady. "Mr. Reeves authorized credential duplication under civilian override privileges," he said. "He approved access to restricted systems and authorized modification of audit records." Every word struck like a hammer. Not speculation. Not rumor. Facts. Public. Permanent. He acted with full knowledge of the consequences, the Admiral added. The whispers grew louder again, spreading through the audience like a rising tide. I watched my father carefully now. For years, he had been the strongest presence in any room, controlled, respected, unshakable. Now he looked smaller, diminished, like something essential had drained out of him. Then he spoke. I was protecting my family. His voice sounded strained, rough, unfamiliar, not confident, not commanding, fragile. That sentence echoed louder than any accusation. Protecting my family, not protecting me, not protecting truth, protecting image, protecting reputation, protecting Daniel. The realization settled deep in my chest. Daniel stepped forward slightly, his voice low but sharp enough to carry. "You changed the records." He didn't shout, didn't accuse, just asked. That question carried disbelief so heavy it felt like grief. My father didn't answer immediately. His silence stretched long enough to become its own confession. Daniel took another small step backward. Not dramatic, not loud, just distance. That movement hit harder than words ever could. All eyes shifted toward me then. Not because I spoke, because I didn't. I stood still, shoulders squared, breathing steady. Years of silence pressed against this moment. But it didn't feel weak anymore. It felt powerful, contained, controlled. Admiral Bennett turned slightly toward me. Officer Rachel Monroe acted according to established safety protocol, he said clearly. Her actions prevented unauthorized shipment movement that could have placed personnel at risk. The room reacted differently this time. Not with whispers. With quiet recognition. A single officer stood first, clapping once. Then another joined. Then another. Applause spread slowly across the hall, building from hesitant acknowledgement into something steady and real. Not loud celebration, earned respect. The sound wrapped around me, settling into my chest in a way I hadn't felt in years. Admiral Bennett stepped forward, holding a formal certificate folder in his hands. He approached me slowly, deliberately, every movement carrying weight. When he stopped in front of me, he extended the folder. "This recognition should have been yours years ago," he said quietly. I reached out and accepted it. The paper felt heavier than it should have, its weight pressing into my palms like proof of something I had almost stopped believing in. Justice. Delayed. But delivered? I glanced back toward my family. My mother's eyes were filled with tears now, her shoulders shaking slightly. Daniel stood motionless, staring at the floor as if the ground itself had betrayed him. And my father, he looked older. Not physically. Emotionally? Like something inside him had collapsed completely. No one rushed to his defense. No one spoke in his favor. Silence replaced authority. And for the first time in years, I felt something shift inside my chest. Not anger. Not triumph. Release. The weight of shame I had carried for so long loosened, slipping away piece by piece. Not erased, but replaced. By truth. I held the certificate tightly, feeling its edges press into my fingertips as the applause slowly faded. Then I looked at Daniel. He lifted his gaze slowly, meeting my eyes. There was no pride left there. No certainty. Only confusion. Regret beginning to take shape. Questions forming that neither of us had answers for yet. And as the room settled into uneasy silence once more, one thought lingered heavier than the rest. Now that the truth was finally spoken, what happens to a family built on a lie? The applause faded slowly, dissolving into uneasy silence that settled over the room like dust after a storm. People shifted in their seats, whispering behind raised hands. Conversations broke into quiet fragments, scattered across the hall. Some guests avoided looking toward my family altogether, as if silence could shield them from the discomfort of witnessing truth unravel in public. I remained standing where I was, the certificate still resting in my hands. For a moment, I didn't move, didn't speak, just stood there, letting the weight of everything settle into place. Across the room, my father lowered himself slowly into his chair. The movement wasn't dramatic, but it carried something heavier than exhaustion. His shoulders curved inward slightly, like the strength that once defined him had drained away without warning. Not physically broken, emotionally collapsed. Admiral Bennett cleared his throat and returned to the microphone. "The ceremony will now continue," he said evenly. His voice remained steady, professional, but the energy inside the room had changed. What had begun as celebration now carried tension beneath the surface, something restrained and careful. Daniel stepped forward when his name was called again. He walked toward the podium without his earlier confidence. His posture remained straight, but the ease was gone. His shoulders were tight, his jaw set firmly, like he was holding himself together through force of habit. When the certificate for his promotion was handed to him, the applause came, but weaker now. Measured. Respectful. Not joyful. I watched him accept it quietly. He didn't smile. Didn't glance toward the audience. Didn't acknowledge the recognition the way he normally would. Instead, his gaze flickered toward me once, then dropped to the floor. When the ceremony ended, guests began rising from their seats. Conversation started again, but softer this time, more cautious. Some people glanced at me with curiosity. Others nodded slightly, a silent recognition that replaced the whispers I had grown used to. I turned toward the exit, not rushing, just walking. Each step felt lighter than the last. Before I reached the doors, I heard it. Rachel, wait. My mother's voice. Soft. Uncertain. Not commanding. Not proud. Just fragile. I stopped. But I didn't turn right away. That hesitation mattered. For years, I had turned immediately whenever my family called. I had reacted without thinking, responding to their expectations before considering my own. Now, I let the silence stretch. Then slowly, I turned back. My mother stood a few feet away, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. Her eyes were red, her expression uncertain in a way I had never seen before. I didn't know, she said quietly. I didn't understand what really happened. Her voice broke slightly at the edges. Not dramatic, just honest. For the first time, she didn't sound defensive. She sounded lost. I listened without interrupting, without reacting, just listening. Daniel stepped forward next, more hesitant than I expected. He met my eyes and held my gaze, something he hadn't done in years. I thought you made the wrong call, he said slowly. I never asked what really happened. That sentence carried more weight than an apology ever could, because it revealed something deeper than anger. Neglect. Assumption. Trust placed in authority without question. For a moment, something inside me softened. Not forgiveness. Understanding. Then I looked toward my father. He remained seated, his hands resting heavily on his knees. He looked smaller now, not because of age, but because of what had been stripped away. Power. Control. Reputation. He didn't look at me immediately. When he finally did, his expression carried something I had never seen before. Not authority. Not pride. Acceptance. I believed protecting reputation mattered more than truth, he said quietly. No excuses. No explanations. Just admission. That was the first honest thing he had said in years. I stepped closer, my voice calm when I finally spoke. What hurt most wasn't the accusation, I said. It was that none of you asked me what happened. The words came out steady. Controlled. Not angry. Not bitter. Just true. I learned how to stand alone because I had to. I continued. No one interrupted. No one argued. Silence filled the space between us, heavy with understanding that arrived years too late. After a moment, I turned again toward the exit. No dramatic goodbye. No emotional collapse. Just movement. Walking forward. The doors opened as I stepped outside. Sunlight spilling across the pavement. Warm air brushed against my face, carrying the scent of ocean salt and distant traffic. For the first time in years, my chest felt lighter. Not invisible. Not forgotten. Seen. Recognized. Restored. I walked slowly across the courtyard, my fingers tracing the edge of the certificate folder. The official seal pressed beneath my fingertips felt solid. Permanent. A reminder of something I had almost stopped believing in. Truth. It doesn't always arrive when you want it to. Sometimes it takes years. Sometimes it takes courage to hold on to silence until the truth finds its way back to you. I stopped near the parking area and looked down at the folder again. For so long, I thought honor came from recognition, from applause, from approval, from the voices of people who mattered. But now I understood something different. Honor isn't something others give you. It's something you carry quietly, even when no one else sees it. There are moments in life when people try to erase your name. Not loudly, not publicly, but quietly through silence, doubt, and distance. They rewrite your story without asking for your truth. And sometimes you spend years believing them, until one day, the truth returns. Not because you forced it, but because truth has a way of surviving longer than lies. I stood there for a moment, breathing in the warm air, feeling something inside me settle into place. Not revenge, not victory, peace. And if you've ever stood somewhere feeling like you didn't belong, if you've ever had someone question your worth without hearing your side, I want you to remember this. Silence doesn't erase who you are. Truth doesn't disappear just because others refuse to see it. And if this story felt familiar to you, If you've ever been overlooked, ignored, or made to feel invisible, I'd really like to hear your story. Share it in the comments, because sometimes the strongest thing we can do is speak after years of being silent. And if stories like this remind you that dignity matters, that truth matters, then stay with this channel. There are more stories waiting, stories about quiet strength, about justice that arrives when no one expects it, and about the moments when the tables finally turn. Subscribe, stay a while, and remember, sometimes the quietest victories are the ones that echo the longest.